tree like that for eggplant, but found that it was really kind of not as linear because there's been a lot of gene flow back and forth. Because a lot of the Asian eggplant types are really highly interfertile. So there's a lot of likely gene flow and crossing sort of back and forth between the more wild species and the more cultivated ones. So people tried to make this sort of genetic tree and it was not very clear and linear. And what folks, there's a lot of debate, but what folks are saying is that a lot of the Asian accessions of eggplant are showing sort of an African origin. So just to go over this really quickly, this is one system of sort of understanding eggplant history, I guess, that folks look at. On the left, you'll see Solanum incanum. So A through D, those groups are actually native to East Africa and Western Asia. And folks are thinking that group A and B evolved into C and then eventually D. And then on the right-hand side, we have Solanum melanogaena, which F was sort of the wild version that got domesticated and kind of grew into G and into eventually H. And folks think that E is sort of this wild one that keeps crossing back and forth with these other ones.
Is that also the E from East Africa and Western Asia?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is super interesting. So this is fascinating to me because I'm curious to think about how folks choose to kind of select and develop or preserve eggplant varieties. Supposedly right now, the World Vegetable Center has eggplant from over 90 countries, which theoretically is the largest quote unquote gene bank of eggplant in the world. But I'm sort of curious to think about, what is going to happen with this gene bank and who is holding these seeds and how they're going to be utilized. One question that comes up that's interesting is that I read that African elephants and impalas are known to eat the fruit and kind of disperse the seeds of wild eggplant relatives. And so a question is, how are the wild relatives actually being impacted by habitat loss in different areas? So currently right now in the world, the top producers of eggplants commercially are China, India, and Egypt. But of course, I have a lot of questions about about this. And also, I think in the sort of world of breeding and seeds, there's no denying sort of the rich diversity and lineage of eggplants from Asia. But I just wanted to show this. This is some seed catalog names, but I think, of course, we see a lot of context and information left out. Orient Express is apparently the only thing they have to share is that it is the most dependable Asian eggplant. But anyhow, I just wanted to show this and my brain thinking about, who is sort of naming and creating and stewarding eggplants and how, and also where folks are acquiring eggplants in the world, whether you're chefs or eaters. So here's a photo, actually from Chef Amanda, of eggplants at the market, the Vietnamese market in San Jose, with eggplants that come from China. This is not an eggplant picture on the right, but selfishly and just me thinking of my food systems brain of this terrible exotic oriental sweet mix being grown in Guatemala. Where are these things coming from and how are they being directed in this way? So anyhow, I just wanted to share a little bit about the context. But I think with that, we're actually gonna bring on our guests. So we're going to start with Christina. So Christina is the owner and farmer of Troy Division, which is a diversified veggie farm with a focus on growing East Asian heritage crops. And she's going to share about her experience growing eggplants in the Northeast, as well as some varieties she's worked with and potential market outlets for some of these different varieties. Okay, take it away, Christina.
Thanks, Kelly. Let me pull up my PowerPoint. Where did it go? Okay, there it is. Great. There we go. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. As Kelly said, my name is Christina, and I'm the farmer and owner of Troy Division. We're based in the Hudson Valley in New York. And today we're going to talk about kind of our cultures and practices around eggplant. A little bit about the farm. We are in our 3rd year of production, and we grow on about 1.25 acres. We have really special soil called the black dirt, which, as you can see from this photo, is really rich. It's like that's its natural color. We don't add any compost or any kind of amendments to it, which is kind of important to consider because one of the things we'll talk about later is kind of like fertilizer and fertigating. It's something that I don't have a lot of experience or knowledge in, but I know that eggplant is a heavy feeder. So something to bear in mind when kind of adapting some of these practices for your own growing. We market primarily through a CSA, and we focus growing solely on Asian vegetables. Some of the varieties that we grow on the farm include ping tong, which is like your classic kind of Taiwanese eggplant. It's pretty long, about like 8 to 10 inches, and that like light lavender color. We grow kama, which is a Japanese heirloom variety, really cute round shape and much denser flesh. We grow 2 mini eggplant types, fairy tale and patio baby. Those are pretty common and popular varieties across small farms. They're really reliable producers, and they tend to be very like tender little eggplants. This year, we also tried growing the Thai round eggplant, which is that last one you see on the right. And listening to Kelly's presentation, I think I've learned that the Thai round is maybe a different species. It's the inconum instead of the melangina, which is fascinating because like growing it, it was such a different experience than the other guys, because it took a lot longer to get started. And I felt like it didn't really start producing in good quantity until much later in the season, which isn't great for us because our season is relatively short. We also grew the mestiza variety, which isn't pictured here, but it's a Filipino variety. It's long and slender like the ping tong eggplant, maybe a little skinnier, but has the same beautiful coloration as the fairy tale. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we grow our eggplant from like start to finish. So you want to start your seeds about 6 to 8 weeks before last frost. And for us, that is starting really around April. There have been times when I've started them even earlier, like in March. But I find that it's not great for the plants. They do get a little bit stressed out being in the greenhouse that long, and they don't need quite as much time as like a pepper. So I usually do like peppers in March, and then I'll do like eggplants in April. So they can catch up. They grow pretty quickly. We like to densely seed them in 20-row seeders, or we use like a 128 tray and like pinch a few seeds per cell. This way we can kind of like economize on our heat mat space, since once again, like it's really cold here, so we need to put them on heat mats if we want good, even germination. Then what we'll do is after we get our germination, we will prick them out. And what that means is like we'll pull everything up out of the soil, we'll disentangle them, and then we'll like bury them into like individual cells to give them a chance to reach full size before transplanting them. You can do this once your seed leaves are really established, so you can't really do it too early, basically. We like to bury the entire stem when we transplant, so just everything up until the leaves, which you'll see in like the next video I show, because eggplants and all solanums do something called adventitious rooting, which means that soil contact with the stem will encourage rooting to occur. So it'll just create a stronger, sturdier plant by doing that. Our preferred trays for this are these 30-cell trays you see pictured here. Most people use a standard 50-cell 1020 tray, which is fine, but we like the 30-cell trays because it has more of like a V-shaped cell. So I think the roots are much stronger and they're much deeper, and I think they kind of like transplant a little bit better when you put them in the field. And here we have a little video that we took for potting up. So you can see here we've kind of separated all of our plants. We put them on top of each cell. And we actually didn't make little holes in each block, but you can kind of just like poke them in. Our potting mix is pretty like fluffy because we don't really like compact it down after we fill each tray. So we're able to just kind of push them in like this really quickly. Oops. Okay. The next step is knowing when to transplant it into the field. In the photo on the right, you can see how much growth kind of to expect between those first early days of your seed leaves emerging and when it's kind of basically an adult plant ready to go. So we've got around, I think, 2 sets of true leaves here, and the plant is about 4 or 5 inches tall. And it should have also filled out that the soil block that it's in the tray. You should be able to like pick up the plant, and the roots, like everything just comes out. So it's like one ball, and that's how you know it's ready to be transplanted outside. And of course, you have to make sure your weather is right. As long as you passed your last frost, then you are ready to go. So when we plant in the field, we usually use plastic mulch simply because the weed pressure is so high in our soil. In general, I would recommend any kind of mulch to be used if you're using a long season crop, but you can use more organic mulches instead of plastic. Other advantages like of using mulch is that there's more heat retention, so it helps it grow a little bit more vigorously early on in the season and helps with water retention and during dry years. Our bed's usually 36 inches wide, and we'll do 2 row staggered spacing. For some of the baby varieties, we've tried doing 18-inch spacing between, but honestly, it feels a little cramped. So I'd recommend at least 24 inches for most varieties. And then here you can see in the photo what the roots look like in the block, and it's like completely filled out. So after planting, we do have a couple of main things we need to worry about. Our biggest pests out here are the Colorado potato beetle and flea beetles. Our flea beetles here aren't pictured, but you've probably seen flea beetles on brassicas. They're tiny and they're black and they jump around. And they create tons of little like buckshot type holes in your leaves. And you'll get both of these pests at the same time, basically. So the potato beetle here, as an adult, will eat through some of your leaves, but it's really when they lay eggs and they hatch, they create these tiny little squishy worm versions of themselves, and they are voracious eaters, and they will decimate your plants. Between those 2 pests, you can lose your entire crop very quickly and very easily. Usually we either we'll go manually and pick everybody off and knock them into like a bucket of soapy water to kill them and crush the eggs, but you can't really do that with the flea beetles. So what we find works best is to just cover everything immediately after transplanting, and then just to remove the cover once we start to see flowering, because at that point at least the plants are more established and they're a little bit better able to kind of withstand any damage that might occur. And then also if you plant potatoes, they also love to attack potatoes. Sometimes they go after tomatoes, not so much, but these guys really wreak havoc for us in our fields. So like I said before, you want to make sure you cover them with netting after you transplant them. And then before you do that, you can also make sure if there's any flowers that start appearing before your plant is really at size, you kind of want to remove those, simply because you want the plant to put more energy into developing more leaves, stronger root system. You don't want it to start developing fruit also, especially when the plant is not physically strong enough to be producing fruit and holding on to it, basically. It's better for it in the long run. And like I mentioned earlier, most of you will probably have to consider some kind of fertilizer regimen. We have very high like nitrogen and phosphorus in our soil, so we don't really need to. But once again, it's a heavy feeder, so something worth doing more research on. Or maybe somebody else in this session can talk more on as well. One of the main things we learned about eggplant growing over these last 2 years is that it does really well in wet conditions. Last year, we experienced a lot of flooding, a lot of heavy rain. And this year we experienced the complete opposite. We experienced a drought, essentially, and a heat wave, and they really, really struggled this year. They did produce, but the yield was much lower than what we had in the past. I feel like it was less than half of what we had last year with the same amount of bed feet. Whereas last year, it's like we could barely keep up with harvesting them, and the plants were much bigger as well. So if you're able, I would recommend more regular irrigation versus less. With the exception of the combo variety, which Kristen has developed to be fairly drought adapted and drought tolerant, those were the ones that really kept pushing through in the dry conditions, but all of our other varieties really had a hard time. So the big thing is when to harvest. So we are talking about harvesting for eating versus harvesting for seed. One thing we always look for is what size it's at, and that will vary from variety to variety. But your main indicator is really that your fruit is glossy and that it's firm. Once your fruit passes the glossy stage and starts to become matte, it is overripe. It's starting to develop seed, and the flavor will change as well. So I would say once you see a good sized fruit, there's no reason to wait too long. You should go ahead and pick it because your harvest window isn't super long, especially in like the peak of summer. And for us, our harvest season is usually from mid-July to October. Ping Tong is nice. You can harvest it really at an earlier stage and it's still really good. The others you can, but it feels like it's not worth it because they can't. It's better to just get them at their fuller size. I don't think they're as good when they're small. There's just like not a lot of like meat on them, I guess. For us, our main markets are once again like CSA and wholesale. Ping Tong we find is especially popular with our customers who are predominantly East Asian, and it's probably because it's the most familiar to everybody. But the Patio Baby and the Fairy Tale are really popular with our restaurant customers. I think because they're small, so they can do a lot of like different kind of like cute things with them. And like the Thai round, it's popular with some of our Thai customers, but honestly, we didn't do a great job growing those this year. So I'd be interested to see kind of like how we can find more customers for that eggplant. But overall, like I feel like people are really aware of how like delicious like the pink tongue eggplant is because it is seedless and it's so silky smooth that people really do seek it out. So we haven't really had a lot of trouble moving it. And I think that is the end of our presentation.
Thank you so much. I know you mentioned also that your crew doesn't like harvesting the camo because they're just spiky.
Yes.
Is there any other like ease of harvest and just handling that like differences between your varieties, or is that kind of the main?
I think that's the main one. Interestingly, we found that late in the season, eggplant produces a lot of like this really crazy pollen that really irritates our lungs. I don't know if anyone else has ever experienced that, but it feels super irritating to breathe in sometimes. And we'll like, COVID was really helpful because we all had our masks on us, so we just put our masks on when harvesting eggplant, or even at the end of the year when we mow down that section, we're like we wear a mask. So I'm not sure what it is, but I guess it's part of the trend of like solanum, like being a nightshade. Part of it is just like a little bit irritating to our system sometimes. Between that and the thorns, those are like the worst parts. But otherwise they're pretty good. They're pretty chill. We like them.
Awesome, thank you. Do folks have any questions for Christina? Feel free to jump in now if you do.
And if you think of anything later, you can always like DM me on Instagram or you can ask us in the chat.
Cool, thank you so much. I think we'll invite our next guest up, who is Chris. So Chris is a researcher and educator, and he has work that focuses basically on science and ag education. He lives in the Sacramento Valley, I think I got that right, and grows Palestinian crops. So I'm going to invite Chris up next, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, let me get my screen shared. There, can you guys see this image? Can I get a thumbs up if you can? Awesome.
Yes.
So great. Hi, everybody. Like Kelly said, my name is Chris. Very excited to be here today and to follow all that wonderful information from Christina. Thanks for providing all those great details. I think I'm going to provide a more high-level overview of growing Betnjan batiri, that's or batiri eggplant. It's an eggplant from Palestine, from the village of Batir, which you can see on this slide. I've been growing it in the Sacramento Valley, just outside of Winters, which is Putwood land. For the past year, I work with Cultural Roots Nursery. We're a small Nursery growing mostly Asian diaspora heritage fruits and veggies and herb starts. We sell them at farmers markets in the Bay Area. It was founded by Lee Schmidt and Z Hussein, and Lee is currently kind of the lead every person, Renaissance woman who does it all. So I've been very grateful to be kind of taken under her wing and got some experience growing different Palestinian plants in winters this past year. So yeah, also we're very lucky because we're going to be hearing from Vivian Sensor, who's done a lot of work preserving and helping kind of bring this eggplant, the stories of this eggplant forward. So I'm going to keep my information, I think, yeah, like I said, high level, and keep this presentation pretty short so that we can hear from Vivian and play off of each other. But yeah, I wanted to start showing this picture of the village of Batir. It's, as you can see, it's very beautiful. It's lush and green. I'm assuming this image was taken in the winter, since it's not always lush and green in the hills of Palestine. It gets pretty dry. It's a kind of a classic Mediterranean climate where it's a rainy, wet season in the winter and then dry summer. And it's similar to what we have here in the Sacramento Valley. So the eggplants theoretically would grow really well here. Batir's a very interesting place. It has this like amazing multi-thousand-year history with like amazing irrigation ditches and a lot of like specific like farming related history that we can get a little bit more into. But yeah, growing the eggplant here, we start them similarly in these like 200 cell trays. We typically start the Batir eggplant in February or March. I find that they take a long time to germinate and then to get kind of to the size that we want before we would transplant them and put them out in the field. I think the germination is like 2 or 3 weeks, and we always germinate them on a heat mat. You can see here what they look like when they first come up. They're very cute. And kind of skipping a little bit, here's what they look like when they're a little bit more mature plants. So one thing, I don't have a photo of it, but when we plant them out in the fields, it was interesting, Christina, that you were saying that eggplants are heavy feeders, because I did a little informal, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say a trial this year, but where in half of the eggplants I grew, roughly half, I like put in a handful of worm castings in the hole before I planted them. And in the other half, I didn't do that. And I noticed a really marked difference in how they were growing. So the eggplants that had worm castings in the hole, those plants were much more robust, much more leafy. They grew like honestly twice as tall. They were more like 2 to 3 feet tall, bushy plants compared to the other eggplants that didn't have any supplemental fertilizer. They were smaller and they still produce lots of eggplant, but they were just like a little more spindly. So that's, yeah, that was interesting. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, you can see one of the things that makes Batir eggplant unique are these little spikes growing on the flower, the flower cap. It's similarly, it's not like necessarily a fun plant to harvest because you will prick yourself unintentionally quite often. But that's, yeah, one of the things that makes it distinct. And one thing that's really interesting about eggplants in general is their pollination. So they're often, so usually eggplants can self-pollinate. So in a single flower, you'll have both the stamen and the pistil. So just from like a little breeze or the kind of plants being shaken or brushed up against, pollen can make its way. Sorry, I have a cat attacking my ankle. Pollen can, yeah, the plants can be pollinated and produce fruit. They don't need an insect pollinator, but they really benefit from an insect pollinator. So when you have a pollinator come in, that can increase your fruit set where you have a higher quantity and quality of fruit. But what's cool about eggplants and solanum is they can only be pollinated, solanum species in general, like a lot of tomatoes too, they're pollinated by this specific method called buzz pollination. So rather than the pollinator coming and collecting pollen from one flower and bringing it to another flower, as it would typically do, they latch onto the flower. And this is something that bumblebees often do specifically. They like latch onto the flower and like vigorously shake their body to get the pollen out. And in doing so, they like better pollinate. the flowers, which it's very fun to see. You can like Google YouTube videos of buzz pollination, and that's what it's actually called. So I think that's very fun. And it's also, just a little side note, something that I've been thinking about, and I think is very, yeah, I think it's beautiful. And I think there's a story there that I want to continue to like find the thread in and be able to tell, is how I've seen so many different native bee species visiting our eggplant flowers, like a lot of different bumblebees, a lot of different sweat bees, a lot of digger bees, and a lot of the different Palestinian plants that I'm growing in general will have California native bee species visiting them. And so you have these plants that are not necessarily from this land here in California, but they're sustaining our native bees. And then simultaneously, our native bees are sustaining these plants. And I think it's a beautiful story of like the how they make relations with each other and how they're so interdependent, and how even in like migration and in diaspora, we can be sustaining like the places that we're in now where we've settled. Showing a little bit more photos, Christina, also, it was funny that you talked about flea beetles. That was my biggest challenge this year. So you can see this plant on the left was pretty decimated by the flea beetles. It was not a concern. It was my first year growing eggplant out here, so it was not something I was necessarily anticipating, but we had a pretty severe infestation of them, and I struggled with figuring out how to control them. I tried using some diatomaceous earth, which didn't seem to make too much of a difference. I'd be curious if folks have input or suggestions. I like that idea of like covering them earlier in the season. I've also heard that you can grow trap crops around the eggplant. So something like radish or something else that flea beetles will gravitate toward that you don't mind losing. You can grow that in a nearby area, and it will kind of detract them from the eggplant theoretically. Yeah, here's what the fruit looks like on the right. It's I think it's similar in some ways to the ping tongue eggplant. It's like a longer, deep purple fruit. It can get up to be like 6 to 8 inches long, I'd say. It's very creamy. It's like delicious. It's like one of my favorite eggplants to eat. And similarly, you would harvest it if you're harvesting it to eat when it's like kind of shiny and bright, and before it gets to be a more matte color. And in this photo, it's already getting to be a more matte color. But if you let them ripen even further, you'll notice that they turn this kind of yellowish color, and that's like the color of the mature fruit. And that's around the time when I've been harvesting them to save seeds from them. And we're going to have a little seed saving demo from Kanoa, so won't talk too much about the specifics of that. But from one eggplant, you're able to save a lot of seeds. And I typically, when I pick the eggplant from which I want to save seeds, I pick it from the most robust looking plant that looks the healthiest. And then from the fruit that is probably like not like the biggest fruit necessarily, but the fruit that just feels like heavy and firm and nice. And like the one that I really want to eat, the one that seems like it'd be the best one to eat, is the one I want to actually save the seeds from, because I want to preserve some of those traits for the next year of growing them. And yeah, in terms of how we eat these eggplants, so this photo I think is one of the most common preparations for the batiri eggplant. So in the photo, it's that's not batiri eggplant. That's like what might be called an Indian eggplant, the small round one. But it's Palestinians like love stuffing any and all vegetables, usually with like a rice and lamb or rice and beef mixture, but there's lots of vegetarian mixtures that it could be used as well, like with frika, which is like a roasted wheat. And then you would stew those stuffed veggies in like a tomatoey sauce or tomatoey broth. So here on these platters, you see kusa or squash, the betanjan or the eggplant, and then there's silik on the right. It's Swiss chard, stuffed Swiss chard. I'd be curious if like Nadia or Vivian or others have thoughts too. I don't think betanjan batiri would be used to make something like baba ganoush. It might be, or matabal or something. I think when I've seen those dishes made, it's usually with like what's more similar to like an Italian globe eggplant. I think from my experience and what I've heard from, and yeah, like talking to my grandparents, the betanjan batiri, it's more prized for like eating this way or making makdous with, which is like a pickled and stuffed eggplant, which Mo Abu Taha showed folks how to make in the virtual cook along the other week. But Yeah, and I have a few more photos here, but these are photos from Vivian. So I want to give Vivian a chance to talk about them. And yeah, I guess actually one thing I'll say, just a little anecdote is so this is my first year growing the Bit Gen Batiri, like I said. And earlier in the year, I logged onto Instagram, and one of the first things that I saw, it was like a suggested page you follow, and it was called @BetandJan Batiri. And I was like, oh, that's funny. Like, what is this little Instagram page that just came up? And I clicked it, and in the bio, it's talking about this like Sacramento, Bethlehem eggplant agricultural exchange. And Sacramento, I love Sacramento. I love living here, but Sacramento usually doesn't have all this great stuff going on that like some of y'all in other places have. So when I saw Sacramento had this exchange, I got super excited and immediately like messaged that Instagram account. And I was like, who are you people? Like, what are you doing? And I want to get in on this and get to meet you all. It turns out that was something that Vivian was helping set up with Riyadh Bahur, who's in Sacramento. And that was actually how I first met Vivian. But yeah, that was like a funny little segue and transition. And so I can hand it off, but I'll also see if there's any questions before.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was so rich. And I just loved seeing that village terraced picture and thinking about them growing there. I think if there aren't questions, and we can still continue to take questions, I'm imagining there will be kind of more of a conversation too with you and Vivian with a lot of crossover content. So maybe I'll invite Vivian up as well, and I'll keep you up too, if that's okay.
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Oh, hi, Vivian.
I'm really sorry that Zoom technicalities for some reason not allowing me on my computer. So I'm on my phone, but I'm really happy to be with you all. It's so exciting to see so many people so interested in eggplant in particular and in love with it, and also kind of taking it so seriously with every seed and every recipe from all over, like with all our diverse background. And it makes me think a lot about the Palestinian saying "El Batin Bustan," which means literally that the belly is a garden, and we are all in the belly of Mother Earth. And we're siblings in this way. And actually, this is a term used to describe, for example, two sisters who are from the same mother, but they're very different in character, or they have different features. And so it just, this little potluck Zoom is showing how our differences and the way we have interacted with different plant siblings has really reaped such beautiful diversity that actually gives us so much more power, including the way we're exchanging now this information. So just commenting on how lovely it is to be in this conversation. Sorry. And thank you so much, Nadia, for inviting me. So yeah, I can talk about and yes, very nice to be on this with Chris, because it was such a delightful surprise to be in Sacramento. I was in Sacramento. When was it, Chris?
I think that was earlier this year, maybe in like June.
Oh yeah, June. You're right. It was June. And so, and then my friend Riyadh Bahur, who is unfortunately not with us on the Zoom right now, he some of my seeds flew in his hands. We don't know how, and he actually was able to. Okay, well, I'll start first that the Batiri eggplant is actually a very, very prized eggplant in Palestine. And Chris, maybe you can show another picture of the village, Batir. You can, yeah. And maybe you can see the terracing in the village. So the village is basically an ancient village. It has one of the world's unique irrigation systems that goes back to pre-Roman times, and the irrigation system operates basically uh, not just because of it operates because we have these water springs that are in the village, and so the village has 8 days a week, not 7 days a week. And the reason is that everybody in the village shares the water source in a big pool that comes from the spring, and then it irrigates. So each family, because there are 8 families in the village of Batir, so each family gets a day. That's why the week is 8 days, because there are 8 families. And so the way we typically plant eggplants is by creating these I don't know in English, we call them mashakib. They're like beds, but they're not raised beds. They're little they're like little, I don't know what to say, but
A
it's
terrace?
they're in terraces, but they're like little beds, but they're not raised beds. Because what happens is when the water comes through the canals, the water goes from the canal straight into these little pools, and that's where the eggplant grows. So the eggplant, actually, the Batiri eggplant is very sweet. You can eat it raw and it's not bitter. That's because it gets so much water, it really loses its bitterness. And in the village of Batir as well, there is the train that runs, which is actually part of the Silk Route. So it's an ancient train track. And traditionally, before 1948, before the establishment of the State of Israel, people in the village of Batir, particularly women, would cultivate the eggplants, put it on their heads in baskets, and go to the train station, and they would sell the eggplants in the train station, which meant that the eggplant, the Batiri eggplant, traveled so much around the world because the train station would end up, the train ends up by the coast. And so the eggplant would move to the coastal towns and then get on ships and go around the world. So I mean, I often, as Palestinians today who are restricted from movement, we're like, I always say I'm jealous of the eggplants because uh, they travel way more freely than I was able to. Um, but this is important because in 1948, Israel destroyed this train station, and so now the train continues to go through our village, but you cannot, there's no train station, and people are not even allowed close to the train. So this is important because when we talk about agrobiodiversity, when we talk about the diversity of eggplant, it was wonderful how all of you shared about your eggplant and where this eggplant comes from and what this eggplant. So it's impossible to talk about agrobiodiversity without talking about political and cultural structures that actually make it really difficult for literally some of our crops that we love to survive, including this Batiri eggplant that we're talking to you about. Because even though we love this eggplant so much, a lot of the young people, particularly in our village in Batir, are leaving the village because what used to be a source of income, the Batiri eggplant, was a very important crop. It's no longer feasible because travel restrictions, not just by the train story, but also Bethlehem, which is the district where Batir is in, is also being severed by segregation wall, by checkpoints. And so women, and I say women because particularly it was mostly women who actually went to the markets to sell the eggplants, are no longer able or allowed to go and sell the eggplants. So you'll see that a lot of them, for example, risk their lives literally walk across mountains with the eggplants just to go and put the eggplants in the street in Jerusalem to sell them on the side of the road. And often they are treated as illegals, and the Israeli police comes with horses and destroys the eggplants and other crops that they have. And this is important to talk about again, because we can't really talk about food and how we're going to survive climate crisis and all of that without talking about the political structures that all of these things we love live under. And so I wanted to just say that this eggplant that we're very much in love with, that I grew up so loving, uh, is under threat because we no longer can grow it the way we used to, and the the terraces where we actually grow it still are also threatened because up until 3 years ago, Israel had planned to build a wall straight into these ancient terraces. And again, these terraces, like I said, are thousands of years old. And so this also represents another fear we have continuously, that are we going to be able to continue to grow our eggplants? And another challenge we have is the fact that these eggplants, the ones that actually Chris has and Chris grew, are important because they are the original heirlooms. Today in the village of Batir, with a very big push to agro development and agro industry, uh, the eggplant, the original heirloom eggplant, has been crossed with a tomato that's supposed to fight certain aphids, and so that has changed the characteristics of the eggplant. And that means, and my father is 90 years old, and he is someone who can really taste things, and obviously also grew up eating this eggplant. And last year when I brought him eggplants, he's like, this doesn't taste like batiri. And that's because they've been crossed with this tomato, and it doesn't taste the same, and the skin has become much harder because, you know, industry wants it to last longer, blah blah blah. And so the Palestine Heirloom Seed Library, which is the initiative that I run, we've been trying to keep some of these seeds that are the original eggplant, which is the soft skin one. And that's why I actually initially gave them to Riyadh, who's in Sacramento, because Sacramento is a place that is very similar in climate. And I was so happy that he basically was able to grow 500 seedlings, which he shared with a few people in Sacramento. I mean, our idea is hopefully to be able to exchange knowledge, exchange more information about how well they did. Friends of mine on the East Coast have tried to grow the Batiri eggplant, and in some places more down south, it didn't do as well because the humidity was just too much for it. Or at least, you know, that's one of the theories. So yeah, we love our eggplant a lot. As a child, we actually, like Chris said, the crown of these eggplants is very thorny. But as a kid, we actually eat that part too. So we make stews, we stuff it, but we let it cook in a stew, and then the crown, which is thorny, we also add it to the stew. And after it cooks, the thorn becomes tender and you're able to eat it. And as such, I mean, this is one of my favorite things actually with for the eggplant. It's not the eggplant, it's the green thorny crown when it's cooked. And what else to tell you about these eggplants? Just I just shared with Chris. Chris, maybe you can share a little bit of the pictures. As an attempt to also revive these eggplants, we have in the village now what's called the Eggplant Festival, Mahrajan Bitinjan, and people are invited from all over to come in October to celebrate with us the eggplants. And also we have a lot of stories and myths around the eggplant, including sayings like when your hair starts to shed in the fall, we say that the hair sheds with the bitinjan, with the eggplant. Also, when you have little like worms on your hand as a kid, there's this old I don't know, like a bruja thing we do, like a witchy thing where your grandmother sends you to put thorns in the eggplant and bury it. And if you do that, if you have a pimple, it will go away. So it's a very, like I said, loved crop. And we're trying so much to keep it alive, despite the fact that there are lots of um, really challenges to continue to do that. And finally, I just want to say, yes, we like to stuff everything. I last year, or no, 2 years ago, in the middle of the pandemic, I was playing around with a friend of mine, and we made a 1-minute video of how to make very fast eggplant dish in your house from your garden. So maybe Chris can play it for us. If sound can work, can you do that? Thanks.
I think Kelly might be able to play it with sound. Would that work, Kelly?
Yeah, let me give it a try. Okay. Oh,
There's no sound.
uh, hmm. Okay. Let's see. I may need to change some of my settings. Let's see. Give me a minute. But yeah, if folks have questions for either Vivian or Chris while I play with my sound, feel free to jump in.
I guess I had a question, even Vivian, like if farmers in Batir, how much they irrigate the eggplant? Because Christina was saying how a lot of the eggplants that she grows in the Hudson Valley are really, they can handle a lot of water and they can handle unexpected flooding. And I just assumed that the Baturi eggplant was a little more drought tolerant and did better without water. I did irrigate it like every like week or two. I wasn't irrigating it heavily. But could it grow without a lot of supplemental water, or has it usually been grown with?
Yeah, actually, no, it loves water. Actually, you have to drown like these sunken beds that we create. Literally, the canal, the water comes like gushing from the canal, and we drown like it's a pool, almost like a very shallow pool. So it takes a lot of water. It loves water. It is not it doesn't do well with the dryness. If you notice, there are some of the eggplants that I shared that have a wilted color, not so dark. And those are ones that have experienced thirst, basically. And we don't like them so much. They don't taste as nice. So yeah, it can take a lot of water. I almost like those ones that I showed you that were wilted, I planted them in my garden, which is not in the village. So I was irrigating them by just watering them every other day. And it wasn't even enough. And my friend who's from Batir would always yell at me from a distance when we're working at the same time. No, غرقيهم, which means like drown them, drown them. And for me, because I'm used to I'm growing rain-fed crop, I don't irrigate so much. So, but for him, because they're used to doing that, he's like, no, for the eggplant. And usually in the same mashkabe, whatever, the same terrace, usually there are other things, mostly mint, that people also grow with along with these eggplants.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Thanks for sharing.
But yeah, a lot of water. It can take a lot of water. So actually, Chris, I didn't think about that when we were this summer exchanging a lot of messages, that maybe folks didn't realize inside. I didn't think about it, that it needs actually a lot more water, more than the other crops that we usually work with.
Yeah, well, that's what's interesting, because for folks in the audience, and I can also remove my spotlight for now. Like a lot of Palestinian crops are very drought tolerant. They can be grown using like battle agricultural methods, which is like rain fed. So some, like there's a eggplant, or there's a watermelon, the Jadui watermelon, that Vivian's also done a lot of wonderful work preserving, and it's yeah, it doesn't need a lot of supplemental irrigation. It gets like watered very deeply when it's first planted, and it forms a deep root system, and it benefits from that early kind of soaking and drenching, but then throughout the rest of the growing season does well without being regularly watered. So it's interesting that how there's so much variation.
Actually, my friend Nate just joined the call, and he's also been growing our eggplants. So maybe he wants to say something. Hi, Nate.
Hi, Vivi. Hi, everybody. I actually just processed the eggplant seeds, some rotten fruit that I grew here in New Jersey, and the fruits look rotten, but the seeds look perfect. So we're gonna have we have hundreds of fresh seeds to continue to think of people.
Yeah, Nate is part with the Experimental Farm Network, and they are our partners in the United States. And so they do sell the Batiri eggplant, right, Nate? It's in the catalog now.
We will sell it come January.
Okay, cool. But yeah, just to your note, Chris, yeah, in the Hudson Valley, of course it did so, like, because we get so much rain in the Hudson Valley that it goes, you know, it can take it. Yeah. Sorry, I think Nadia, that's hands up.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you, Chris and Vivian. I had a question about Vivian, if you know other varieties of Betinjan that are like known and loved in Palestine, and what they are.
Yeah, so there are two others that people like. They're grown in the northern parts. One is called the Ajami or Farisi, or I don't know, the Ajami and the Farisi, I think they're kind of one of the same. I'm not so familiar with that variety, but it is that that fat variety that Chris was describing, that people like to use for making baba ghanoush and mtabbal. And mostly people in the north really like it because they don't grow batiri eggplant. But it's called farsi, which refers to Persian, like they call it the Persian eggplant. But I don't know, to be honest, much about it. But I know it exists. Mostly in Nablus area, they grow it a lot.
Mm.
And I'm interested, Vivian, in showing you the Syrian eggplant that we grew in collaboration with some folks in Princeton that came from refugees from Syria at a refugee camp in Lebanon. And I'm curious to see if it's similar to any of those other varieties from the north or any others. It's a bit stockier, a bit more square than the batiri, but it's really beautiful, done really well. I'll send you pictures.
That sounds great. I'm excited about it.
I think it's from Homs, somewhere in that area.
Okay, I think I might be able to play this video if you're still wanting to see Vivian's video. Let's try this one more time.
I collect hot peppers, za'atar, parsley, mint, chard.
Can we start from
sometimes
the beginning?
even
Yes.
I crack the heart of the eggplant open after roasting it in the oven on high heat. I collect hot peppers, za'atar, parsley, mint, chard, sometimes even fresh mlukhiyya leaves from my garden. I chop them all up finely with a little bit of garlic and half an onion. I stuff the belly of the eggplant with the greens. Tahini is the perfect sauce, made from the sesame seeds I love so much. I mix it with a little bit of lemon, some water, a little bit of salt, and then I bathe the eggplants with the liquid. It's really simple, but then again, simple things are always the best. صحة وهنا.
That sounds so good. I didn't eat like a real lunch. I want to eat that for the end.
I just this was, like I said, we were playing with this video, but the idea is that it's so simple. I would just throw the eggplant in the oven, and once it's baked, you know, whatever's out, like whatever's growing in the garden that day, like peppers, mint, whatever, and just cut it all up and stuff it in there and put some tahini and lemon, and it's delicious.
Sounds so good.
Another thing that reminded me of that's like definitely not as artful, but a very simple way to eat batiri eggplant, or really any eggplant that I do, is like I cut them just in half because they're small, but with a bigger one, you could probably cut it into pieces. And I like kind of saute it, I guess, on both sides so it gets golden. And then I just put it in pita bread with a bunch of jarjir or like arugula. And then I make like a little tahini water and lemon juice kind of sauce, just like you stir it all together with a fork and it gets like fluffier instead of the tahini, which can be kind of dense on its own. So just like pita bread, warm eggplant, tons of arugula, and this like tahini sauce. It's like a delicious like vegan lunch sandwich. So another recipe idea that your dish made me think of, Vivian.
Sounds good.
That was so interesting, Vivian, how you shared that folks really enjoy eating the crown and that the spikes just soften when you cook them. That, I mean, that was such a surprise to me and just super, super interesting that.
That's my favorite. When I was a kid, we fight for them. Like we fight for them in the pot because, you know, I wanted more.
um,
I
does
think there's
anybody,
Sahar has a question.
Sahar?
Okay. Yes, hi, I am Sahar. I've been wondering if there is any way in general for the eggplant from the color to know if it's bitter or sweet, like the color or.
Oh, interesting. I think that for me, I think the darker, the sweeter. Sometimes with the batiri ones, because it means they had more water. And the more water, the sweeter they are, less bitter. But maybe other people have a different experience, Chris or Nate or anybody else.
Yeah, I don't know from the color so much, but I think when they're really firm, like you can tell when they're firm and it almost looks like a water balloon. Like that one I feel like is when it's at its best, when it's like firm and bulbous and kind of shiny. And yeah, I think that deep dark color is a good indicator, but that is a good question.
Thank you. And I have another question. Again, it's in general. Do we know like what kind of like the species of the eggplant from the flower? Do they have like different kind or they have all the same flower when we plant them?
Oh, Chris, do you want to? I think, I mean, some of them have different flower, but I mean, again, I am, to be honest, like I only grow batiri eggplant, so I don't feel equipped to answer this question. I don't know, Nate, is Nate still on? Because Nate is a master plant geek.
Thanks. And I'll put my video on for a second to just wave hello. I'm in my truck. don't have the best service. But we, your question is about species, like,
If you can tell the species from the flower.
you know, I think that most of the things that we call eggplants are all the same species, which is Solanum melongena, the eggplant species. But there are other things that get called eggplants that are different species, like certain African eggplants, the orange ones that they get sold as a pumpkin on a stick. Those are Solanum ethiopicum, named after Ethiopia, and there are small, very small eggplants like that they call pea eggplants, that might be Solanum anguivi. That the plants look very different, but within eggplant, what we consider eggplants, there is.
I think we might have lost Nate for a minute.
I feel like
Yeah.
that was right when he was getting to the juicy part of the story.
Yeah, so in the beginning we showed some slides with different, there's actually a lot of species in the Solanum genus and a number of things that people use and call eggplants, which are edible and delicious and nutritious, that are different species. So there's Macrocarpum, Ethiopicum, Torvum, and those all have different looking flowers than the melongena, or the one that we've been primarily talking about today. Hopefully that helps.
Can you hear me now again?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was basically saying the same thing, but the other thing I just wanted to mention is that within Solanum melongena, the common eggplant species, there is a lot of morphological diversity, a lot of different types of flowers, even different color flowers, different types of leaves. Some plants have spikes, some don't have spikes. Because it has spread so far around the world, and there are still reservoirs of wild eggplant type plants out there that cross with them. There's just so much, there is so much diversity. So I think botanists probably have an answer if you look under a microscope, or if you really look detailed at the flower structures, you might be able to tell. But from my perspective as somewhat of a layperson in scientific botany, I don't know how exactly to define an eggplant flower. And from the ones I've grown, which are quite many, I've seen a lot of what looks like very, very different flowers, different colors and sizes and shapes.
Thanks, Nate.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any other questions for Chris or Vivian? I just wanted to say thank you so much, Vivian. Each time I hear you speak, I learn so much, and just sort of the way that you weave together the rich sort of cultural landscape of where these crops and plants are existing. And I think I really appreciate you mentioning the importance and significance of the political and social structures that make it difficult for us to sustain and preserve and steward and be in relationship with our crops and our plants that we love the way we want to. And so I just wanted to thank you for that, as that, that's such an important piece of our work and our conversations here, since we know that we can't just preserve the genes of something that doesn't do anybody anything. So thank
you. And this gathering is obviously the kind of work we need to be doing. So thank you, and Nadia and all of you for putting this together and showing up for it, because I think these conversations are what we need to be doing and having So thank you.
Thank you. So we can have a little bit more room for questions at the end if folks want to. I'm sure there's lots brewing. But before we move to our next guest, I wanted to just have us actually do a quick poll. So just for humor's sake. So I don't know if folks have ever heard of this thing. It's just called a waterfall response, but I'll put up a couple questions and you'll get an opportunity to think about it. I'll also read it aloud if folks can't see the full screen. And then when I say go, everybody's going to respond in the chat at the same time so we can all see the responses. So I'm just going to do this with 2 short questions just to see where folks are at. So give me just a moment. Okay, so the first question is, what are the eggplant varieties that are most desired for you and your community? So go ahead and think about that for a minute. What are the eggplant varieties that are most desired for you and your community? Okay, so now if you have the capacity, when I say go on 3, everybody will enter it into the chat. Okay, so are folks ready? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Batiri, ping tongue, batiri, ping tongue, ping tongue, ping tongue, batiri. I think also there's an acknowledgement too that we may not know the full names or indigenous names or names in different languages of eggplants that we're looking for or that we love in our communities also. So you can put that as well. Okay, so part 2 of this question is, give me just a second. So part 2 of this question is, are these varieties accessible, fresh, and easy to find where you currently live? So go ahead and think about this for a second. Are these varieties accessible, fresh, and easy to find? Okay, and we're gonna do another waterfall response on 3. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so I see no, 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 no. Longest drive, only at farmers markets, not really, depends, maybe Bay Area. Cool, thank you so much for participating in that. Just really curious and interesting to see, you know, where folks are accessing the eggplants that they love and know, or that they're not available. I'd love to return to this question in a little bit, but first, well, actually, maybe I'll ask folks now. So if you were a yes, if anybody's willing to share, where do you find them? So if your answer was yes, what were the varieties that you get and where do you get them? You can put it in the chat if you like. Canoa, yes, only because they grow them. For folks that put depends on the neighborhood, maybe you can specify as well. So there's some farmers market folks. Okay, so if folks put no, second part of the question, if folks put no, what were the varieties that you were looking for and who is looking for them? Or what community is looking for them? So I did see a lot of no's in the beginning. Does anybody want to share and go off mute?
Kelly, the question was, where do we find them, or what communities are looking for them?
So the question was that if you reply no to the question, yeah, what community is looking for them? And if you replied yes, you could share where do you find them?
I'll go. I mean, it's like the smaller eggplants that we use for stuffing, and also for pickling or curing in makdous. And that's usually like Arab community, Levantine, Syrian, Arab, Palestinian, Lebanese, Jordanian. Yeah.
Thank you, Nadia. And you put no, they're not available.
They're not as easy to find. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Especially the size, it's like the size of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Does anybody else want to quickly share? Sahar?
Yes, I live in Monterey, and we never had eggplant except the big one. So you can't do anything except, but maybe baba ganoush or like some. I'm always looking for any kind of eggplant, but like what Nadia said, small size. Maybe we can stuff them, maybe we can bake them, cook them different way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I went to LA last time, and then I had to bring there. You can find many kind in LA.
You came back with a whole bunch of eggplant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
I would just say that it's definitely easier in the summer when there is chance for local production, but in winter it's much harder for any of them. And then mainly only we get yeah, the big Italian type, and then depending on where you go, maybe something like pingtung or just some skinny type, but the big ones maybe could come. I mean, I'm sorry, the little ones, like small Indian types that might fit the bill for some of the things that you're talking about, Sahih, find in Indian shops. But I think in Monterey, I don't know. And then it's hit and miss whether they have it when you go. But yeah, especially less so in winter.
Can I add something?
Please.
Because, from our culture, in our country, we always dried let's say, talk about eggplant. We dried the eggplant from October and November. We dried them, but ready, like we remove everything from inside, and then we stuff them in the winter. We use it. So dried vegetables, very good. That's how we do it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Another amazing preservation.
Yeah, because it's seasonal.
Mm-hmm. I love hearing about the preservation technologies. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I think that this really speaks to us, continuing to build the skills to grow and save and steward the seeds of the varieties that we want to. So this is a good segue to Kanoa, who's going to share about some other eggplant varieties that have been grown on their farm, as well as about saving and processing eggplant seeds. So Kanoa is farmer and co-founder of Feral Heart Farm, which is on Mwekma, Ohlone land. And is going to talk about some of the varieties that you have seen, but also a couple other different varieties. Mitoyo, a Thai, and I think a Sri Lankan type. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I'm on 2 different ones, so hopefully, yeah, this should be fine now. Thanks for having me, Kelly, and everyone. I'm honored to be here. Yeah, I've been growing eggplants for as long as I've been farming, which is almost 20 years, and I really love them. It's one of the vegetables I most remember from my childhood, and it was produced in a wonderful, just very simple, sliced and battered with a little flour and egg, and fried in the in the pan, served with just with a dash of salt. So a lovely, simple thing that my mom, who's Filipino and Chinese, would make for us. I am growing a bunch of different types of eggplant that Kelly mentioned. Some of them, 3 of them are trials from Seed Savers Exchange. And I could just show one of them because I don't have the others, but this is a white type, and it's kind of this shape. Some of them are a little bit smaller like this. And it's interesting. This one has a really interesting texture. There's another larger white type, and that one has been nice for roasting. It's like a round type. The mitoyo is a I guess by its name, I don't know anything about it other than it sounds like it would be a Japanese type of eggplant. And that one is also grows pretty large, almost like an Italian type. So I like growing those for making things like creamy roasting things. But then another type that I will demonstrate today. We're also growing pingtung, and then and I am growing the Ethiopican type, which is one that is called Turkish orange, and the name is I find actually kind of annoying because, and I call it something else, but because it seemed to imply that that's when you eat it, but it's actually it's okay to eat then, but it's very bitter at that stage. As long as you're ready, you understand, then you can make the dish so it's like that. But they seem to be more, that species, at least on my farm, is more tolerant to things like flea beetles and the other bugs that we don't have. The Colorado potato beetle where we are, but there's also we have a problem with lygus bugs, and they're a really tiny bug. You can barely see them, and what happens with our eggplant is they grow very big and luscious. So, and as they flower, the bug will bite the flower stem, and then the flowers drop, and we won't have fruit. So I'll see that, and that becomes a problem until the plants get big enough and can just flower more than. And then I think the predator bugs come and start to bring things back into balance. I have used neem on them a couple of times in the past, and that has helped. So here's a picture, or here's some of the Sri Lankan. This is a seed that I've traveled to Sri Lanka. My housemate is Sri Lankan, and when I was there visiting, this is like an eggplant. These are quite ripe. They've turned yellow, but they have this like beautiful stripe, purple striped and white type. Let me pull out one that's that are actually so good to eat. So you can see more like color. that are like this. So they kind of look a lot like I think there's a type called fairy tale that's sold that are like these. And interestingly enough, this one really holds up well in soups and curries, which I find to be a very nice thing for an eggplant. Obviously, like the big Italian type, if you cook it in a soup, it just completely falls apart. So let's see, I will show now that what I've started doing here is, here's my blender. This is going to be basically a demonstration of how to save the seeds. And I started already cutting some of the eggplant centers out. Here are the ones that I worked on just a little bit ago, and they're already turning brown, and I've scooped the seeds out, and I'll demonstrate what the first thing I'm going to do. Interrupt me if you have any questions or at any time, and I'm happy to explain further or what. So I scored this eggplant, and I like to score it instead of cutting it all the way through because I'll damage fewer of the seeds. And then I'll just can peel it open like this, and we can see a bunch of the seeds in there. And then I'll use a grapefruit spoon or some other kind of sharp spoon and try to dig the seed cavity out. At a certain point, you could use your fingernails too. And then I'll just drop them into the blender, scrape this is using my phone on a tripod is new for me to try to do this thing.
Does the density of the flesh change as it's turning yellow, or is it still dense?
Oh yeah, it's kind of like others were explaining how when it's ideal to pick for food. It starts to lose its color, or it changes color. Like these have changed color, and you can feel also when you squeeze them, the firmness changes in a way that's a little hard to explain. But when you're used to picking the fruits for food, there is some kind of some give into that. I think that they become even firmer as they're ripening their seeds. And I noticed I was gonna. Thanks, Fred. Does that help? The thing I noticed about this eggplant and a lot of eggplants when I've saved seeds from eggplant in the past, I'd wait until they were almost like they were just so ripe that they were kind of like Nate was saying, they're just like almost rotting on the plants. And the problem I had with that, at least for me, was cutting them open. A lot of times the seeds would already be sprouting inside the fruit. And I thought, oh, well, I wasn't able to separate the seeds that hadn't sprouted already. Obviously, they're not going to dry and be good. So I realized, and speaking with some other folks who grow seeds, yeah, Chris, that happened with melons too, for me as well, is to get them like this. There's still some stripes. They're not fully yellow, and they're very, but I know that as when it starts to show the yellow color, that the seeds will be good inside and developed. And that's generally true for the variety. So even this white variety, I'm letting some seeds go, but not on this one, obviously, on the plant still. And the fruits are turning yellow as well. The pington will also turn yellow or orange. And so I'll do one more and then I'll move on to the thing. So scoring a little bit. And just peeling it open. There's the seeds inside. Yeah, if you do notice the seeds obviously already sprouting inside, I don't think it would be good to keep them. Okay, so once you have a bunch of your pulp with seeds inside the in a blender, it may seem crazy, like you're going to cut the seeds up, but what we'll do is add some water to the blender, maybe like that much, so about a cup for as many as I did, and I'll blend it up. And I'll probably mute it while I'm blending it so it won't be super loud. And then all right, so I blended it for a few seconds. And now we're gonna walk over to the sink. And I have now I have just a bowl and a colander, and I'll pour the actually I'll use the bowl second. Now I'll just pour all the contents of the blender through the colander and get the water to start draining through. So cutting it into putting it in the blender like this will grind up a lot of the pulp, and then you can and then it'll push a lot of it will go through the sieve through the colander. I still have some chunks. In here, and actually it kind of looks like might have one of these types. The seeds are quite white, and those might not be ready. So hopefully it won't be too much of a problem, because what we do next is basically, so this method is like a really home scale version of what's called it's basically wet seed harvesting. You have to do this with tomatoes and with peppers generally, melons and cucumbers. So then the next step is to add a bunch of water like this. Oh, sorry. And then the heavy seeds that are good will fall to the bottom, and a lot of the other stuff will float. And any seeds that aren't ready are usually floaters. And so I pour it off.
So you don't ferment them like you would with tomato seeds?
You don't need to. The reason we do it with tomato seeds is because they have each of the tomato seeds has a gel coating around the seeds that needs to ferment away to have good germination, because that gel is a germ inhibiting thing. Eggplants don't have that, so you could do the fermentation with eggplant like at this stage, and I think that what it helps with is if there's a lot of the pulp left behind, it'll help make the pulp softer, and then that will work to have it just go through the sieve once it's if you do that. I haven't tried it, so I'm not sure how that would or wouldn't affect the whether the seeds might just start sprouting. So yeah, So then you just do this a few times to get more of the pulp off. It looks like there's these white seeds that I have in here are actually, let's see if you can see them better. There's actually in there. I don't know if these will, they're heavy enough, but I'm not sure if they're good. They don't seem like they're good, but they're heavy enough that they're not floating. So that's kind of too bad.
Noah, when you just made that assessment of like, I don't think they're good, was it like because you're crushing them in your fingers and they're not as hard, even though they're as dense or
Yeah.
large?
Yeah, what I did was, thanks, Kelly. What I did was I just tried to pierce one with my fingernail and it just felt soft, like there probably isn't an embryo inside those seeds, but they do just sink. They mostly just sink. So yeah, that's too bad. I guess I have other of this seed that I've already saved. This is a demo. I suppose I should try to sprout them. That one cracked.
Do you
So-
think that you harvested them too early, or why do you think that it's turned out that way?
Honestly, I mean, that one must have not been fully ripe seeds. Yeah, I think that must have been that, because there's plenty of others in here that are okay, that have the right color and have this kind of brown color. I wonder if I'll be able to separate this with another method. I might be able to do it with a screen because they look smaller, but uh, sometimes these are trials. But the other, in any case, this is basically the method is to just keep washing them until mostly the pulp is gone. And then I just have this tiny amount, I'll just dry it on a plate in my kitchen, and maybe it just takes like a day or two for the seeds to dry out. If you want to do it on a screen, like in the colander or something like that, then that's cool too, especially if your house is really moist, I suppose. But it's just always so dry here that these things dry out pretty quickly. The other, I wouldn't do it, on a paper towel because they'll stick to the paper towel. You'll have a hard time getting them off. So yeah. So I guess I could try. I don't know what I would do with these now. Maybe what I did was I didn't really look at every single eggplant when I cut them open because I was kind of doing it while we were watching the meeting or while the meeting was happening. But let's see, I'll just finish. Actually, when you're close, then you can just put them back through the colander. Here's another rinse. And then I'll just put them on a plate.
The seeds are so abundant. I think that was only how many fruit?
I did about 6.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I only did 2 for, I had already done maybe like 4 or 5 of them before, and then just demoed 2 of them. But yeah, like Chris said a little earlier, eggplants have a lot of, one eggplant would be enough seeds, but if you can, but then you would really mostly only be propagating the genetics of that one plant, which might be for better or for worse. So I think that's sort of the idea is, even if you don't need that many seeds to still save from as a good number of plants, kind of the way like Chris was mentioning, to ensure like that you are still getting a good amount of diversity from either from the different plants and their structure and their shape, as well as the fruit shape and color.
Well, thank you so much. That was super helpful to see in live action. The demo, even if it wasn't ideal, I think, unfortunately, sorry for you, but I think it's actually really helpful for people as a learning to see, and to be able to ask questions. Yeah, if I guess we could take a couple quick questions. If there's any questions around processing seed for quinoa. It seems like the harvest stage is kind of the key thing. The cleaning seems pretty nice and straightforward.
It looks like there was a question about why the blending. I don't think the blending helps with germination necessarily. It's just to grind up the pulp and make it easier for us to separate the pulp from the seeds. But yeah, I think just to your question, Kelly, or to your comment, Kelly, about selecting fruits for ripeness, probably these all had like ripe seed and underripe seed in them. So because of my experience with the fully yellow or orange fruits last year, I kind of went back a little bit, backed off on that ripeness to avoid that. But it looks like now I'm at the other end of the spectrum with a bunch of undeveloped seeds. The first batch that I did earlier in the summer with these all looked fantastic. In fact, I could, where did they go? Oh, here. This is the earlier batch that I have. That's all, they all look
Ooh, very
really,
lovely color.
really good. And then just as a sort of a thing, I always make sure I label stuff. I have a bunch of different types of eggplants this year. So if I don't put the label on there, and it's just as simple as I just write the common name, maybe something like I wrote striped eggplant. Usually I put like what Sri Lankan variety. This is I can't read the Sinhalese name on the, but I just bought a couple of seed packets when I was there. And I've just been calling it Vambotu, which means eggplant in Sinhalese. But it's a variety that's basically good for curries there, which is like how almost all vegetables are cooked in a curry, like a coconut milk curry in Sri Lanka. So they hold up well in these kinds of applications, soups and curries. And then I always make sure I put the FH. Well, it's backwards, but FH is my farm feral heart, and then the year, because just 22. So I know when I go back and look through all my voluminous amounts of seed containers like these, that I know what and when things were from. So yeah.
There's a quick question. Is the blender method used for other wet seed harvested crops?
I've done them for all the solanums. Well, not tomatoes because you do the fermentation, but it works well for peppers, and it can work for melons too. I would be a little. It works. I think it's okay. Yeah, tomatillos. Yeah, I've done it with tomatillos for sure. And I think the way that I even discovered this was by making juice, like smoothies with Cape gooseberries, with the poha berry, and then finding all the seeds sitting at the bottom of my smoothie. I thought, oh wow, they don't get cut up at all inside there. So, but bigger seeds like cucumbers, you could do it with as well. I think you might want to just experiment to make sure it's enough water that you're not actually damaging the seeds. But I think with so much water in there, if you did it without water, then you're very likely, without any water first, you're very likely to actually damage some of the seeds. So the water helps just really keep the seeds from missing the blades.
Thank you. Thank you. That was so helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Kanoa, when you save seeds like eggplant or any seeds really, do you do any like germination testing before the next season, like just to like see if they'll be viable, or you kind of just like trust that they will be and go with whatever you get? And would open that question to other people who do seed saving as well.
I have done that. I don't tend to, but if I know I'm gonna actually, if it's like a seed contract that I'm selling them, then I do that for my own benefit, but also because it's like required, and to keep some kind of germ test. I do want to try that with some of the peppers that I saved this year. Especially while it's still warm and I don't need to use the heat mat to do that. But it's a good practice. And but often I've just been, I think lately, because of maybe just how my experience in knowing what things look like mostly, then I just tend to trust that what I have is good. And so far that's been, with eggplant, that's been good. I think sometimes it depends on whether I'm, like with the way that I sow peppers is I actually sow them I'm never really sure since I don't do the germ test usually on them. And I'll just sow them in an open flat and just drop them into a trough, and then what comes up, then I don't really know what the germ rate is unless it's really bad. But that's a good question. I should, I intend to always do the germ tests.
Yeah, I'll say I think it's a really good practice for sure. I definitely don't do it for everything, but if I'm like working with a new crop that I'm kind of learning and building a relationship with, I like to do that. Or if it's something where I'm trying a new processing technique, or I'm kind of like experimenting, oh, did this stage of harvest work better, or was there any impact? You know, like harvesting at this stage versus this stage, or even like something I'm curious about is the difference between wet processing and dry processing of chili peppers. So like if there's like something I'm trying to learn about, I'll do a germ test. But yeah, if it's something that I like have been working with and kind of know, I don't usually, but it is a really good practice.
Oh, actually, that reminds me, I made the mistake of drying chili peppers completely before taking the seeds out, and the germination is was very low on those seeds, and it was because you're supposed to get them out of the peppers before they are dried. So as much as, if you do have somebody who gives you a chili and it's dried already, and they're like, you can grow these seeds, this would be great, then if you then you'll probably have very low germ on them. So just sow them all and hope for the best.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much. I think we're just about at 4 already somehow. Yeah, thank you so much to all of our guests. I've learned so much about eggplants. I hope everybody else did too. Yeah, and we'll put this recording online, and just a huge appreciation for Kanoa and Chris, Christina and Vivian. And thank you all for joining us today and participating. Next month, we'll be featuring winter melon, and I believe that there will be some exciting in-person events regarding chili peppers. So keep an eye out for those. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everyone.